All right. So have you ever imagined a company just completely changing, like doing a total 180, new name, new look, the whole nine yards, but then they try to say, oh, we're a total different company now? Yeah, well, that's the wild situation we're diving into today. And trust me, it's a lot more complicated than it sounds. We're talking Philippine corporate law, employee rights, a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, the works. Okay, so let's set the scene right. You're working for a company, everything seems pretty normal, right? And then suddenly, boom, name change, different sign on the building, maybe even a different logo on your paycheck, but you're still doing the same job at the same place with all the same people. So, does that actually mean you're working for a brand new company? And if it does, what happens to your old employment contract?
Well, it might seem like we're getting bogged down in technicalities here, but this whole question of a company's identity, that can have some huge consequences, especially when it comes to protecting workers. In this particular case, it really digs into the core of how Philippine law defines an employee, an employer, and all those responsibilities companies have to their workforce. It's pretty fascinating, actually.
And right at the center of all of this is Rodel Bantagon. He was working as a machine operator, I believe, for a company by the name of Boatwin International Corporation. Things seemed fine, until Boatwin decided, hey, let's rebrand. So they changed their name to PVC Master Manufacturing Corporation. Now, at first, Rodel just kept working, like always. Same
Yeah.
job, same factory, just, a different name on the door, right? In fact, when this case initially went to the labor arbiter and then later to the NLRC, they actually sided with Rodel. I mean, to them, it seemed pretty obvious. Just changing your name doesn't erase a company's obligations. But, and here's where it gets interesting, the Court of Appeals, they came in and totally flipped the script. They sided with the company. Talk about a curveball, right? The Court of Appeals, they basically bought into PVC's entire argument. PVC was saying they were a completely new entity because of something called an asset sale. So they claimed they didn't actually absorb any of Boatwin's employees, which means, technically speaking, Rodel never even worked for them.
Yeah, this is where the case goes way beyond a simple disagreement between, an employer and employee. We're starting to dig into some pretty complex areas of Philippine corporate law here. I mean, this whole asset sale argument, that's actually a pretty common thing companies use when they restructure. But the real question is whether it's being used legitimately. You know what I mean? See, there are actually different kinds of asset sales. Sometimes a company might legitimately sell off a specific part of its business, its assets, but then other times companies might try to use this as a way to, how should I put this, strategically restructure their liabilities, shall we say. And that includes things like employee contracts.
Hold on, are you saying they're trying to pull a fast one, like making it look like a legitimate sale so they can get out of all their obligations?
Well, that's what the Supreme Court ultimately had to decide. And let me tell you, the outcome of this case has some major implications for how companies are held accountable for their actions, even if they try to hide behind things like name changes or corporate restructuring.
Okay, so what we've got here is a company claiming a totally clean slate, a worker basically left in limbo, and the whole legal system trying to figure out if this asset sale was the real deal or just, a clever disguise. This is getting interesting, and this is where things get really interesting. To figure out if this was on the level, a genuine sale, the Supreme Court, they really dug into the nitty-gritty, the details, looking for anything to back up PVC's story. Let me put it this way. Imagine you're buying a car, and I'm talking a really nice car, right? You wouldn't just hand over a stack of cash without any paperwork, would you? You'd want a contract, a receipt, something, right? Proof that the deal actually went down.
Exactly. And that's where things started to fall apart for PVC. There was basically zero documentation, nothing to show that this was legit, a real asset sale. No paper trail, no contracts, no records. It was like it never even happened.
So it's starting to look like they were trying to pull one over on everybody.
Well, the Supreme Court certainly seemed to think so. This lack of evidence, that was a huge red flag for them. It definitely suggested that this wasn't a genuine sale, but more like a calculated move to get out of their obligations.
Okay, so you've got me on the edge of my seat here. What did the Supreme Court say? Did they see through all of this whole corporate shell game? Drum roll, please. In a huge win for workers everywhere, the Supreme Court completely overturned the Court of Appeals decision and ruled in favor of Rodel. Wow, no kidding. So they saw right through the whole name change, the asset sale, all of it.
They did. And the reason they gave, well, it gets to the heart of why this case is so important. The Supreme Court basically said that companies, they can't just shirk their responsibilities to their employees by doing things like changing their name or using these tricky legal moves like asset sales without a really good reason.
So this case it's not just about Rodel and PVC, right? This sets a precedent, a big one for protecting workers. What does this tell other companies who might be thinking about trying something similar?
It sends a really strong message about accountability, that's for sure. The court basically said, look, you can't just mess around with people's livelihoods. They really emphasize that workers have rights, especially when they don't have as much power as their employers.
You mentioned earlier that the Supreme Court, they relied on this idea of constructive dismissal. What does that even mean, and how did it apply to Rodell's situation?
Right. So constructive dismissal, it's basically a way to protect employees in situations where they're forced out of a job, even if they weren't technically fired.
Okay.
Think of it like your employer making your life at work completely miserable on purpose so that you quit and they don't have to go through the whole official process of letting you go. Classic example. So in Rodell's case, even though PVC was saying he never worked for us, the Supreme Court saw that by refusing to acknowledge his work history, they basically made it impossible for the guy to keep working. They backed him into a corner. He had no other choice but to fight back.
So they basically forced his hand. This really shows that employment law, it goes way beyond what's written down in a contract, It's about being fair and making sure people aren't being taken advantage of. But let me ask you this. This all happened in the Philippines, so why should someone, let's say, in a different country care about this case?
That's a great question. You see, even though the actual laws might be different depending on where you are, the ideas behind them, things like fairness, companies taking responsibility, and protecting workers, those are universal, right? This case really drives home how important it is for everyone to understand their rights as an employee and to keep an eye out for these kinds of tactics some companies might try to pull.
So what you're saying is knowledge is power. This might have happened halfway across the world, but there are some seriously valuable lessons here for all of us. This whole thing really makes you wonder, like, how much can companies actually get away with when they're restructuring or even, just changing their name?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's exactly why the Supreme Court ruling is so important. It sets a major precedent for any future cases, and not just in the Philippines, potentially even worldwide.
So it's like a warning shot to other companies thinking about, trying to pull something similar.
Exactly. The court was crystal clear. You can't just use loopholes and these shady legal maneuvers to get out of your obligations to the people who work for you. It really highlights how important transparency and, just basic ethical behavior are in the business world.
This has been seriously eye-opening. What are some key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind, especially if their company goes through big changes like a merger, acquisition, or, even a name change?
Well, the most important thing is to know your rights. Seriously, read your employment contract, familiarize yourself with your company's policies, and look into the labor laws in your country. And never be afraid to ask questions. If something seems off, it probably is.
Right. Don't just assume everything's going to be fine. Like you said, knowledge is power.
Couldn't agree more. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you feel like your rights are being violated, get some legal advice. Don't wait. There are organizations and professionals out there who can help you navigate all that.
It's like Rodel's case proves that even though the legal system can seem intimidating, justice can win out, even against these big corporations.